Welcome to chapter 32, Animals, Chordates, and Vertebrates. Okay, so now what we're talking about here is the, remember when early on in the class we started classifying, or I showed you how taxonomy works, and we used the whole drunk, king, Philip, came over from German soil, right? And that was domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, what chordate is a phylum. And it's the phylum that we are in, humans, along with other animals. Okay, so now what defines a chordate? They have four characteristics that define them. A dorsal nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a postanal tail. So if we look at this image here, we could start from the postanal tail. Okay, a notochord. Okay, that is a notochord. Okay, and now we'll discuss in detail what these lead to, but to be a chordate, an organism has to have these four. Okay, then we have this dorsal tubular nerve cord. So the notochord is typically hollow. This dorsal cord is carrying nerves, and dorsal means back. So think of the back fin of a shark. Okay, it's called the dorsal fin. Anything dorsal means on the back. Pharyngeal, gill, slits. These are pouches here because this is a little organism in utero, but they are gill slits. So these are the four characteristics that make a chordate distinctive and put a chordate inside of the chordate phylum. Okay, next. Vertebrate evolution and diversity. So now vertebrates are they are part of the chordate phylum, but they're not the only thing in the phylum. Now there's different things that define chordates. So there's chordates that lack a head, and there's chordates that have a head, a skull. These are craniates. Okay, and so if a chordate has a head, it's technically a craniate. Okay, a vertebrate, of course, has a skull and a vertebral column or backbone. Tetrapods have 4 limbs or 2 pairs of limbs. They're typically land animals, and they were the first land animals. And they have a jaw. Amniotes have the amniotic egg. So they're typically they're tetrapods typically that live on land and have adapted to live on land, and they have evolved and adapted the amniotic egg. So if you look at an evolutionary tree such as this, you should be able to read it very easily. So I'm going to quickly show you how to do so. Now, you always want to look at everything that's written, and everything that's written in categorized on this particular, on any fork, but in all of these forks in this whole evolutionary tree. Now I want to show you this side over here. Okay, so see how this whole column represents chordates. That means everything from this point to this point is a chordate. Everything from this point upwards is a vertebrate. Everything from this point up is technically called a nastosome, but we don't really worry about that term too much. I don't use it very much. Everything from this point up is a tetrapod. Everything from this point up is an amniote. Now that's one area of this big chart. Now let's look at the rest of it. Okay, so this is showing that there's an ancestor over here. It's non-specific because they're not sure exactly which ancestor is the ancestral chordate. All right, in every split of the fork, every time a fork splits on a tree, there's a reason. and it'll tell you. Okay, this first split is because everything from this point, actually this first split, everything from this point up is a vertebrate. Everything from this point up has a jaw. Everything from this point up has a bony skeleton, has a lung, has 4 limbs, has the amniotic egg, and then the mammary gland. Okay, so you need to be able to read these trees very easily, and they're self-explanatory as long as you know what a split means. Every time it splits, there's a reason for it, and there's a difference. Okay, so we're going to learn some of the chordates, and then we're going to move from these animals to the mammals and to humans. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the lancelet. It's the most simple chordate in existence, and it hardly even looks like an organism, a living organism, but it is. And it's a chordate because it has the postanal tail back here. Okay, it has the dorsal cord, the notochord, and the pharyngeal slit. And the lancelets are pretty small. This is a blown up picture of them. They're tiny, and they've actually been around for a long time. They're shown in the Cambrian explosion. You'll see a little lancelet looking creature, and they definitely have an old history in our world. Now, this is the sea squirt, also known as a tunicate. Very simple. It looks like a vase actually, but it has the 4 properties. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's just interesting that something like this would be in the same phylum as humans, but they have the 4 characteristics. The pharyngeal gill slits, you can see here. Okay, you can see the cords, the notochord, the dorsal cord, the notochord, and the pharyngeal gill slits and the postanal tail is not visible here, but it exists. So they have the 4 characteristics making them a chordate. So these are very unusual, but they qualify. All right, let's move on. So we have jawless fish. Jawless clearly means they don't have a jaw. And the first group we're going to talk about are the hagfish. So hagfish are little scavengers. This is a hagfish right here. It has slime glands. So if you get too close to it, like this individual right here, it will release slime as a defense mechanism. And they just scavenge the sea floor for food. They're nearly blind. These guys are called lancelets. Lancelets have a very particular shape. They look like this, and they have this kind of S shape. It's kind of curved body, but they have this rasping mouth. Okay, see this mouth right here? It's got these little teeth, and it can suck, and basically they are parasitic. They hook on to bigger fish, and they're an ectoparasite. They hook onto the outside, and then they extract nutrients from the animal. Okay, the evolution of the jaw. So those guys are jawless. At some point, the jaw evolved from development and fusion of the skull, gills, the gill slits, and the gill arches. See these arches? They're actually quite bigger than just the gill slits. And over time, these animals evolved jaws. And once jaws are in the picture, this changes everything, because now we have animals with these strong jaws and teeth. And we have some serious predators, okay, like the shark. Now, sharks, they're classified as chondrochites. Chondro, what does chondro mean? Do you guys remember? Chondro means cartilage, and chondro, so they're called chondrochites. Now they're jawed vertebrates. They They're flexible. They have a cartilaginous skeletal system, which allows them to be flexible. And then they hunt through something called the lateral line system. And of course, they have extraordinary sense of smell. They also have electroreceptors in their embedded into their bodies, where they can detect electrical impulses for hunting. Now, these are going to be sharks, rays, and skates. So this is clearly a shark. This is a ray. The largest sharks that we have are the whale shark. Okay, most of them are predators. That's no shocker. Rays live at the bottom of the ocean. Let's look a little closer here. Okay, so this is a ray, and notice how the eyes are on top of its head. The mouth is on the bottom, and they live at the bottom of the ocean. So how can they, catch food? Because of the way that they hunt. They actually can sense electrical currents in the water. And so they can feel the electrical impulses. And guess what? Every living organism emits electrical impulses. So we do, fish do, anything that's alive. And they have this unique capability to sense electrical currents. And then they will just get the animal. They feel it and they just bite. Okay, so if you look close at this big guy right here, see these little black dots? That is the electrical sensory nodes, basically. Okay, so they hunt through something called the lateral line system. This is they have pressure sensitive cells along both sides of the body, and it causes the pressure by other organisms nearby. They can feel that as well, and they'll go after it. Of course, they have this amazing sense of smell, and some parts of their brain, the parts of the brain that are associated with the sense of smell, is actually larger in sharks. So they can smell up to 1/3 of a mile distance away. So definitely, sharks are pretty interesting. One thing that is even more interesting is the most interesting thing is the fact that they can detect electrical energy. Now, sensing electricity is, no other animal can do that. And so typically when a shark bites, they don't really mean to, when they bite a human, they don't like human flesh. They spit it out, actually. And it's usually an accident. And really, they just, they feel this energy, and they feel the electrical impulses that our bodies give off, and then they will just take a bite. And a bite with teeth like this, that will take off a person's leg or something like that. So, of course, we have to be careful if you're out in the waters and you know that there's sharks around. You got to follow the rules and things like that. Like if you travel and go to an island, and they'll tell you, not to do something, you should listen. Now, because I've been to an island on vacation, and they warned us, and they said, do not go too far out into the ocean, because it was very easy to just walk, from the shoreline out into the ocean, because it wasn't, it was very shallow water. So you could end up in the middle of the ocean over here, just by walking, and you could be way, way, way out. And while we were there on vacation, someone got bit by a shark, and it took 2 of their fingers, the pinky and the ring finger, because it just happened. And like I said, they don't like human flesh. I'm sure the shark probably spit it back out. It's just that they feel this big electrical current, and they're a predator. They bite, and that's an issue. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on. Now let's talk about the bony skeleton. So now these are classified as osteochites. Osteochites, remember osteoporosis means, osteon, this all means bone. So these guys have a calcium phosphate reinforced bony skeleton. Okay, and there's two groups, the ray finfish, the lobe finfish, and they've been around for a long time. This is the largest group of vertebrates. There's around 30,000 different species. And I want to point out a couple of important factors. This is the typical anatomy of a ray finfish, and there is their bony skeleton and vertebral column. Okay, and see this kind of, it looks like an organ. Okay, this is this empty air-filled sac called the swim bladder, and it helps keep them afloat and stay buoyant. Hey, what else do these guys have? Okay, of course they have gills. They have a heart, liver, gallbladder, intestine. Okay, yeah, that's good enough. Now, this is the lobe finfish, and they're called lobe fins because of the fact that these fins are not these thin little fins like these guys. They're thick. They're thick and muscular. All right. A lobe finfish, this one right here in particular that has a lung, is thought to be the ancestor to all of our amphibians. Okay, now ray finfish, I showed you a very basic ray finfish over here. This is, like trout, things like that. But there's actually a huge variety of ray finfish, like the angelfish, okay, the eel, the pufferfish or balloonfish, this guy right here, the seahorse, the flounder. All of these guys are ray finfish because they have the same anatomy. Okay, so it is agreed upon by scientists that the lobe finfish is the ancestor to amphibians. And because they have these fleshy, thick, muscular appendages, and they could easily have adapted to life on land, and most of them have a lung, which the other guys have gills. Okay, so they're thinking that these are the ancestor to the amphibian, so it went from this transitional form, okay, to this ancient little amphibian recreated, and then thus we have our first tetrapod, a four-limbed fish that lived in shallow water and could breathe through air. Okay, and this looks a lot like a frog, right? Or a salamander, or a cross between the two. And this is a recreation of what they believe the first tetrapod looked like. All right, so in other words, the lobe finfish, this guy, he gave rise to the amphibians. The amphibians were the first to leave the ocean. They evolved from the lobe finfish. There's around 4,000 species. They vary drastically. They breathe through their lungs and their skin. Most of them have four limbs, and many of them go through metamorphosis. So metamorphosis is the change, of course, between this larva stage and then like the frog, for example. This is the larva, this is the tadpole, and then this is the frog. So there's different types of amphibians. There's frogs, but there's so many different types of frogs, but that is one category. We have salamanders that are amphibians. And these guys right here, these are called caecilians, and they actually don't have any legs, but and they look like a worm or a snake, but they're not a snake. And they're not a worm, they're an amphibian. And a good way to recognize them is because of the fact that their skin is got that shiny kind of appearance, the way that the other reptiles do. Of course, if this was a snake, it would have scales. All right. So these are some more. These are some more amphibians. So we have this one on top that's pretty interesting. This is the poison dart frog. This is a fire salamander, which is really cool. And then this is a closer look at another Sicilian. And yeah. All right. So now amphibians gave rise to reptiles. So they're completely adapted for life on land. They branched off from the amphibians around 250 million years ago, and they evolved scales. They're ectothermic, which means that they have to, like this little guy right here, this lizard, he's laying on a rock. Why? To absorb heat from the rock. Okay, they have lungs, and they have this shelled egg. Having a shelled egg, an amniotic egg, gives an extreme advantage to these animals. It allows them to leave the water and move inland. Now, amphibians are unable to leave the water because or venture off too far because they need it for breathing, to stay moist, and they need it for reproduction. They have to lay their eggs in water. Now, reptiles, they don't need that. They evolved scales so that they won't dry out, and they evolved the amniotic egg so they don't need their eggs to sit in water because the amniotic egg will protect their babies. Okay, now there is a plethora of reptiles. We have our crocodiles, right? We have our turtles. We have tons of turtles. We have our snakes. Okay, and we have our lizards. And of course, the biggest reptile that ever walked the earth, the dinosaurs. All right, so the amniotic egg changed the game for these guys. It allowed animals to not depend on water, and it allowed them to dominate the earth. And in fact, the reason why dinosaurs grew to these astronomically huge sizes was because nothing was stopping them. They were dependent on nothing. They were fierce. They had the amniotic egg, which quickly, let me just go through that. It has a shell, of course, right? And then let's see, let me go into, it has albumin, which is a protein that encases the whole sac. Now inside of here, here's the little embryo, here's the little baby. Okay, so normally, there's no shell and they have to stay moist by water. Now these guys don't. And so they have the whole thing. The amnion is the membrane, this membranous sac that surrounds the baby, the embryo, and then it's supplied with nutrients through the yolk. And it provides oxygen, food, water, removes nitrogenous waste, prevents the egg from drying out, therefore allowing these guys to live inland. Now, this is also, like I said, part of the reason why dinosaurs, which are reptiles, dominated the earth. There was nothing stopping them. They, were able to grow to these huge, enormous sizes because there was nothing getting in their way. And so they did. And so that just goes to show you how if there are, these resources, how big an organism can get if there is no resistance, meaning there is no competitor. They were the dominant predator on the planet for a long, long time in the age of the dinosaurs, and then of course until they were not. Then they were, you know, hit. The planet was hit by the asteroid, and they went extinct. But they did walk the Earth, and they did grow to these huge sizes. And it's because there was nothing stopping them, and they had all of these advantages. All right, next is the birds. Birds, they're classified as aves. Now think of aviation, aviator, right? Now birds and some of their dinosaur relatives have highly developed modified anatomy physiology. Okay, so there are dinosaurs that we have found evidence of, dinosaurs that are related to the bird. Okay, so basically modern day birds have completely changed compared to their ancestors. They're very different than reptiles or anything else because they are endothermic, meaning that they make their own heat inside. They don't have teeth. They have honeycomb-shaped bones, which means that they have a reduced weight. If anything, remember, is honeycomb-shaped. I'll just draw a couple. It's terrible honeycomb, but it's okay. I think you get the point. Okay, so the space in here, in between their bones, is air. Okay, so this makes it possible for them to be lightweight. And then their feathers, they have a hollow shaft in the feathers. They are incredibly smart. They have complex social behaviors, acute senses. They have large brains. They go on migration one time and they will remember the migration forever by memorizing landmarks, excellent eyesight, and then they have excellent muscle control. Birds are incredibly diverse. This is the feathered dinosaur. It's extinct, of course, that scientists believe is the ancestor to birds, or may have been. Right? It's got teeth like a dinosaur. It has claws like a dinosaur, and it has this big, thick, strong vertebral tail like a dinosaur, but then it has feathers all of a sudden. No scales, feathers. So that was interesting. Now, the range and variety of birds is endless. I mean, some birds don't fly, like the ostrich, but is still in the aves category. Or hummingbirds and toucans and parrots, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So some major milestones for vertebrate evolution. Now, the evolution of the jaw was major. This allowed animals to, chordates and vertebrates specifically, to become predators. And becoming a predator allows for the animal to dominate. Okay, so that was major. The jaw. The limbs. So for limbs for locomotion. Having limbs allows you, the organism, to run and walk, and specifically run. So giving them locomotion is big. So jaws, locomotion. And then the amniotic egg, that really changed the game for these animals, because they no longer depended on water for reproduction. Big milestones. Okay. What about mammals? All right, so scientists believe that mammals, which is our class, evolved from reptiles. The chief characteristics of a mammal is that they have mammary glands. They have body hair for insulation. There's a lot of scientists that believe that the hair is modified scales. Almost all of them are endothermic, and the biggest thing is having a respiratory and circulatory system. Okay, So there's three major groups of mammals. The monotremes. Monotremes are egg-laying mammals that secrete milk. Marsupials. Marsupials, everybody knows what a marsupial is, but I'll quickly remind you they have a brief gestation period, which means that they're young when they're actually born. They're not completely developed. Therefore, they finish development in an external pouch. Okay, the most common example is the kangaroo. And then we have the eutherian mammals, also called the eutherian placenta mammals. These are humans and every other animal that has a placenta. Okay, let's look at monotremes and marsupials. All right, so the koala, everybody loves the koala, is a marsupial. The possum. Now, this one's interesting. This is the duck-billed platypus. See his little duck bill right there? There's his eyes, okay? And if you look very close over here at this picture, okay, this is a mama duck-billed platypus. I'm going to zoom in on her so we can check this out. And see, there's its eye right there. I just covered it up, but okay, there's the eye. There's the bill. Okay, so she's in there. And there's its babies. And the babies just hatched out of an egg. And what is it doing? It's nursing on a mammary gland. There's another baby. Okay, but they did not come out of a placenta, out of a womb. They came out of an egg, and that is what makes them different. Okay, so, and we more marsupials, just because they're somewhat interesting. Of course, we know our kangaroo. There's a mama kangaroo with her baby. This is a wallaby. And wallabies are marsupials. This is called a wombat, and there's this little baby. And the Tasmanian devil is actually a marsupial as well. Eutherian placenta mammals. Okay, eutherian placenta mammals are very diverse because they inhabit land, air, sea. Okay, and ultimately, you know, a couple of examples, whales. Whales are in the sea. Land, I mean, the list is endless. There's deer, there's lions, there's monkeys, there's rodents, there's humans. And the list is just, you know, goes on and on and on. And what about the air? Well, bats. So they're pretty diverse. But what they have in common is the placenta. Okay, the next thing we're going to discuss here is primates. All right, primates are interesting because they have things that other animals don't have, such as binocular vision. Binocular vision means that their eyes are on the front of their face instead of the side of their head, like a lot of animals. They have color vision. Okay, color vision. Not most animals are colorblind. They have grasping little hands, large brain. They have hand-eye coordination, and they're social. They have complex social skills. Here's a couple of different primates like the lemur. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the family of hominin, which we belong in. Now, what we're looking at here is an evolutionary timeline that dates back to 7.5 million years ago until today. And these are organisms that have been dated back, and basically they fall into the family hominin, which we are in. Okay, so I'm going to go through them, and we're going to talk about their characteristics. The ones that we have here, this is Ramidus, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus. This guy is Homo habilis. Okay, so we're gonna go through, and this is Homo sapien, of course. So I'm gonna go through each one, and we'll talk more about them and why they are significant. Okay, so homonyms are, again, our family, and therefore humans and all of their fossil relatives. The oldest homonym is, this is the oldest skull, okay, and the short name is Chadensis because it was found in the country of Chad in Africa. Now, ultimately, DNA technology suggests a common ancestry, but we have limited knowledge about these fossils because some of them are partial fossils, some of them are just incomplete, basically. Okay, this guy dates back to 6 million years ago. Although they do fall under homonyms, they exhibited ape-like characteristics as well as human-like characteristics. Australopithecines. So Australopithecines are basically in our same family again, but their genus is different. It's Australopithecus, and then there's different species within. And this is a recreation right here of Australopithecines, and one thing that they are known for and what makes them significant is that they were bipedal. So bipedal, remember the term or the word bi means two, and pedal, think of pedaling a bike. Okay, bipedal means walking on 2 feet. And we have evidence of that based on their anatomy, as well as they have found footprints in these ancient ashes of bipedalism. Okay, so bipedalism is a human characteristic. All right, let me talk about the genus Homo. We are in the genus Homo, and these guys are in the family homonym and related in ways, right? But there is limited knowledge. So the first one is Ramidus, and there was a picture on the previous, a couple of slides ago. And then Eugenesis. Okay, these guys date back to 4 and 6 million years ago, respectively. So again, there's limited knowledge because they found very few species. 6 million years is a long time ago. And they've also found partial skeletons, so they don't know very much about them. Now, the more well-known line is Australopithecus, and their genus dates back to about 4 million years ago. They were bipedal. The advantage of being bipedal, this allows for free hands. When hands are free, that allows for tool making and hunting and other human-like characteristics. Okay, they went extinct about 1.2 million years ago. However, scientists agree or think that they gave rise to the genus Homo because of their similarities. Because later, we see the next group, and they were bipedal. They were able to carry weapons, manipulate tools, and perform other pretty amazing cultural revolutions. Okay. Now, the most famous Australopithecine is Lucy. She was the first one, and I'll show you guys a video on Lucy.
So we're in the airport in Addis, and we're about to board this little plane and fly over the Lucy site, home of Australopithecus afarensis, with Don Johansen, one of my childhood heroes, who has one of the original maps he used to work this place. I mean, how utterly cool is this? Hey, Don.
Here you are.
How you doing?
Great. Welcome aboard.
I can't
Ready
tell you
for
how-
this
I am. I can't-
exciting adventure?
Excited is one word. Look at those rocks. Boom, 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 boom. Just totally stretched out. As a paleontologist, that is what I dream about.
Now, see the volcanic ash cropping out? That's 3.4 million years old.
That is incredible.
One of our unique characteristics is walking on two legs. The question is, what did our ancient two-legged ancestors look like? A fossil found here in the Afar region of Ethiopia gives us a pretty good idea. Don's taking me to see where he found a 3.2 million year old hominid known as Lucy.
It was a Sunday morning back in 1974. So I came up here, looked at this, had no idea what was waiting. It was right in this area, right here. What I saw was a fragment of bone, and I looked at it and almost instantaneously said, that's a hominid.
Wow.
Once we broke that 3 million year barrier, it was a whole new picture of what our earliest ancestors looked like. One of the most exciting moments of my entire career.
Lucy made headlines around the world because although she looked a lot like an ape, she walked on two legs. She was a biped, and at that stage, the most ancient anyone had ever found.
Beautiful view of the camp.
Her bones are some of the best evidence we have for what early bipeds looked like.
Now, of course, if this were all articulated properly, you know, the vertebra on top of one
You'd see
another,
it.
she'd be about 3.5 feet tall. You don't see that.
Yeah, you don't get that.
Here's the femur,
That's the left.
top end of the thigh bone.
And this one also, I mean, when you put it all together, now you have, you know, this is telling bipedal, this is
Right.
giving a hint of bipedal.
This certainly tells it was bipedal. That can't in like that, which is very characteristic. Our knees are close together and they
Yeah,
come
so-
up to the side. The chimps come straight up. So that's another very important aspect.
Having the upper and lower leg in a straight line is no good for a biped. It makes for an awkward, waddling gait. Lucy's legs formed an angle. Her knees were close together, just like our own knees. This positions the feet directly underneath the body, making walking easier and more efficient.
There we are.
Lucy walked much like us, but she wasn't human. She had many primitive features too.
Isn't it interesting? They had the pile of bones. You put her here, and all of a sudden you could see that it was a living person.
She's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. We named her after the people and the land. We named her Australopithecus afarensis, from the Afar region.
So imagine if Lucy was here with us right now. What would she look like?
Well, she'd be short. She's only about 3.5 feet tall. And the one thing that would be familiar to us, that she would be walking upright. But with those long arms, reaching almost down to her knees, she'd probably have a very odd gait. And as she got closer, we'd see that she had a very ape-like face. I think in many ways she looked like the ape that stood up.
Yeah, amazing.
You know?
Yeah.
Like the ape that stood up.
That's amazing.
Lucy gives us a glimpse of a key moment in our evolutionary history. She tells us that by 3.2 million years ago, our ancestors had committed to walking on two legs.
Okay, so let's go on with Australopiths. Now, again, they were bipedal, but they did have small brains. And their spinal cord emerges from the skull at an angle, which is typically more ape-like than human-like. And we have a big opening at the base of our skull called the foramen magnum. And of course, our spinal cord connects to it and vertebral column. And typically, well, in a healthy individual, it should be completely erect, right? Now, with apes and ape-like animals or organisms, the foramen magnum and spinal column protrudes at an angle, therefore exhibiting chimpanzee qualities. Now, Australopithecus did have a more ape-like anatomy in that sense, but they were bipedal. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Now let's meet some new new organisms. These guys are in the same genus as us, and the fact is that we found their fossils. They were carbon dated, and they did walk the earth at some point. And so let's go ahead and talk about what each one is and what's special about them. Okay, this first one is called Homo habilis. Okay, they go back 2.5 million years. These are computer models of what they may have looked like. These are old fossils. Now you can see their protruding forehead. They were found in Africa. The bodies and brains were larger than Australopithecans, but they retained the ape-like long arms and short legs. However, their teeth were human-like. But what was even more interesting is that they were found with tools. Very crude tools, but they were there. And what this means, tools, what that means is that they were actually intellectual enough to develop a tool for hunting. Okay, now the next one is called Homo ergaster, and they were around 2 million years ago. However, these guys migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia. Their limbs were more proportionate to humans, and a lot of scientists, evolutionary scientists, believe that they gave rise to Homo erectus and Heidelbergensis. All right, this is Homo erectus, and they were called Homo erect because of their anatomy and that they were fully erect. They were taller than the other guys. Their brains were larger, and they left Africa. They went to Asia almost 2 million years ago. Of course, they were bipedal, but they not only had tools, they had fire, therefore indicating they had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Heidelbergensis, okay, so Heidelbergensis is thought to be the common ancestor to Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapien, which is our species. Now, they originated in Africa, and actually all of the Homo genus originated in Africa. So that means, in other words, no matter which way you look at it, we all came from Africa. And then, they started spreading out, leaving Africa, going to Europe, going to Asia, going to the Middle East. And this is such a long time ago that natural selection and evolution have changed. It have allowed organisms to change. Okay, so either way, their migration out of Africa is significant, and that is the real purpose or point of this whole, what I'm saying. Okay, now they're similar to Homo erectus, and then again, they are thought to have given rise to Neanderthalis and Homo sapien. So let's talk about Neanderthalis. Neanderthalis is so interesting. They are more interesting to me than anyone else because here they have an interesting story. So let me tell you a little bit about them, then I'll tell you their story. So, of course, they had large brains, and their tools were absolutely spectacular. In fact, they have the most sophisticated tools other than our species. So, they have records of Homo sapien that are found in Europe. Mostly, a lot of them mostly are found in Europe that date back 150,000 years ago. So that's a long time ago. 70,000 years ago, they started spreading out through Europe and Asia. And then 30,000 years ago, they go extinct. They just disappear. And at the same time that they were walking the earth, so was Homo sapien, our species. And so there has always been this big question about what happened to them. Where do they go? How did they die off? And the general consensus was that, okay, well, Homo sapien was intellectually superior, and that they wiped out Neanderthals because of that, because they were superior. Now there's new theories based on DNA evidence showing that Homo neanderthalis may have went extinct by inbreeding with Homo sapien. So instead of actually going extinct, what happened is, what they're saying is that they inbred with the Homo sapien to the point where eventually their species was no more because they integrated with the Homo sapien species. Now, there's two pictures here. This picture is an older picture, and this is what they thought Homo neanderthalis looked like. Now, based on new DNA technology, it is pretty amazing. They've found genes for Neanderthals that show that they actually had red hair, some freckles, and blue eyes. Now, it's very different than this picture over here. Okay, so as we, go through and advance in technology, we're going to be able to learn more and more and more about our history. Neanderthals walked fully erect. They were incredibly dexterous. They were incredibly talented in making tools. Their tools are actually complex. When scientists tried to mimic their tool making, it was pretty difficult actually, and they figured out the technique eventually, but it was not a simple one. Now, based on DNA evidence, this is what they're saying now. And this is true because you really cannot argue with DNA. They're saying that Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapien had to have inbred. And therefore, if we take anyone's DNA today, including mine, yours, anyone's DNA, we can find up to 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Okay, now this is non-African individuals, so as you go on closer and closer to Africa, I suppose the numbers get lower and lower. So, mostly European descent will have around 3. I really haven't, 4 is the max, but it's more around 3. And then as you get closer to Africa, the numbers decrease. And then also Asia, Asian culture or Asian countries, they have a low number as well. Okay, so that's interesting because now, the thought is, well, it's not that, Homo sapien was just intellectually superior. They inbred with them, and eventually we outnumbered them, and they got integrated genetically into our species. And they're trying to now figure out what exactly did we get from them. And there is some evidence that we got some immune genes from Neanderthals. But this is a newer project, a younger project, so they're still piecing together the whole story. Okay, so I mentioned tools earlier. And why they matter is because the more sophisticated the tool, the more intellectual the species. Now, if you look at this tool, this is Homo habilis, and it's a pretty crude tool, but they were smart enough to keep one side soft and make the other side jagged for chopping something or, you know, hitting something for hunting. Homo ergaster has these very beautiful tools, very complex, and they probably tied them to spears. And Homo neanderthalis have the most amazing tools. Theirs are very sophisticated. It even appears that certain tools were designed to hunt certain sized animals, which suggest their intellect. Now we get to Homo sapien, which is our species, modern humans. And what we're looking at is a comparison between Australopithecines and Homo sapien. The distinction is pretty big, pretty astronomical. Anyway, Homo sapien shows up on the scene 200,000 years ago in Africa, and they leave in waves. They spread out to the Middle East and to Europe and all over the planet, of course. Now, these are some interesting facts about Homo sapien. They were very sophisticated. They were far more sophisticated than Neanderthals, and we refer to these guys as Cro-Magnons, even though they are our species. These guys that go back 90,000 years ago are Cro-Magnons. And what they have found is pretty amazing. There's artifacts from Cro-Magnons that show that they made flutes. Why is that important? Because this means that they, music was involved, music and art. They made they're pretty graceful, pretty elaborate ivory sculpture. So this suggests high intellect, because it's not about just survival and hunting and eating and breeding. It is now about something else. They are demonstrating, high intellect by producing music and art, and then they had. There's evidence of these very sophisticated, elaborate burials. So what we're looking at here, this is a skeleton, obviously, but on top, this is a crown. Okay, that's a crown on top, and then there's artifacts. See how there's something in the skeleton's hand? There's artifacts in here. So what, right? Well, actually, that's a big deal, because they are the first ones and the only ones to be found this way. And what this means is that they were thinking about life after death, the afterlife. So this is huge. Okay, and then of course they left magnificent art in caves. This is one picture of some of the cave art that's found in France. And there was a time where you could go and see this, but this kind of stuff, but you no longer can. It's closed to the public because people were putting graffiti and drawing things on the cave, and that's just I don't know who would do something like that, but people do stupid things. Therefore, you can't see them anymore, but they do put pictures out, and this is pretty amazing. So that demonstrates intellect. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the fact is that all Homo sapien originated in Africa, and they spread out all over the world in different waves. And, that is that. And then over time, people change because of where they live. Because if you live up here, in the northern hemisphere, people are going to, it's not as hot, right? And basically people are going to start to change, losing pigmentation and evolving and adapting to their environment. Okay, this guy is called Homo florensis. It's somewhat new. It was found on this island in Indonesia, and basically they date back to 18,000 years ago, and they found these guys, and they're small. They have a small skeleton, a skeletal system, a small skull, and here this is Homo florensis next to Homo sapien, showing how small the skull is, and they nicknamed it the Hobbit. Now here's the thing with that. They don't have full evidence on exactly what's going on with this, because there's a lot of, at first they thought it was a child. They figured out it wasn't a child. Here's the excavation site in the Indonesian island of Flores. Okay, so that's where the term Homo florensis comes from. And they found an entire population of these guys. However, you have to remember they're on an island. So they could have been just isolated on an island, and they could have a genetic defect. Now, there's still a lot of questions, and they don't know the full story here, but basically a lot of people, okay, these are the 3 theories that are running around, or that are on the top of the list of science, right? So they believe that either 1, 2, or 3, these are all on the table. First is Homo florensis was some kind of dwarf descendant of Homo erectus, or some others believe they were more closely related to Homo habilis, because Homo habilis was short. And then others suggest it's not a species at all, but it's Homo sapien with a genetic disorder that causes a bone malformation. And because they were isolated on the island, they just, bred and had a population of with this genetic disorder. I personally agree with this one right here. All right, so they're still working on that, figuring out exactly where it belongs. Okay, how did organisms evolve large brains? There's a lot of theories behind that. The fact that meat came into the diet before they were just eating vegetation. Once they started hunting and consuming meat, cooking their meat. Now meat has a lot of proteins and nutrients, more than a plant could ever have. And at that point, they think that the organisms from that point, the different species, they evolved because of their diets, and they became socially interactive, and they became hunters, gatherers, making tools, all of that. Now, what makes humans completely unique is that we are the only ones that have language, abstract thought, and advanced culture. And now there are genes. There's genes for language, and we have them. And so there's DNA evidence that we are the only ones that had the language. Now